The fog hung thick over the rolling fields of northeastern France on the morning of September 19th, 1944. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper peered through the mist from the open turret of his M18 tank destroyer, knowing that somewhere in that gray curtain, German armor was advancing. His vehicle, nicknamed the Hellcat, represented one of the most controversial weapons in the American arsenal. Many high-ranking officers had doubted its worth. Some had outright refused to use it. Yet, on this cold morning near the town of Aricourt, the Hellcat was about to prove every skeptic wrong. Suddenly, through the fog just 30 feet away, the distinctive muzzle of a German tank gun emerged from the white void. Leiper's heart raced, but his training kicked in instantly. He barked orders to his crew, and within seconds, the Hellcat's 76mm gun roared to life. The German tank erupted in flames before its crew even realized they were under attack. But there wasn't time to celebrate. More shapes were materializing in the fog. More targets. More threats. What happened next would become one of the most remarkable tank battles of World War II. In just 5 minutes, Leiper's platoon destroyed 5 German tanks from the feared 113th Panzer Brigade. The cost? 1 Hellcat lost. But the battle was far from over. As the fog began to lift, the full scale of the German assault became clear. Dozens of Panther tanks, among the most formidable armored vehicles in the world, were bearing down on American positions. By the time the guns fell silent 3 days later, the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had accomplished something extraordinary. They had knocked out 39 German tanks while losing only 4 M18s destroyed and 3 damaged. One sergeant, Henry Hartmann, personally accounted for 6 German tanks from his single Hellcat, most of them the dreaded Panthers, that American tankers had learned to fear and respect. If you're finding this story as fascinating as we do, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We bring you these incredible true stories from history every week, and your support helps us continue this work. Drop a comment below and let us know what you think about the Hellcat story so far. But to understand how this unlikely vehicle achieved such remarkable success, we need to go back to the beginning, back to when the United States Army was desperately trying to figure out how to stop the German blitzkrieg. The answer they came up with would be championed by some generals and opposed by others. It would save countless American lives, yet nearly didn't make it to the battlefield at all. The story begins in the dark days of 1940, when the world watched in horror as German panzer divisions tore through Europe with unprecedented speed and violence. Poland had fallen in weeks. France, the great military power of Europe, had collapsed in barely a month. The secret wasn't just better tanks or better soldiers. It was a new way of fighting, concentrating armored forces at decisive points to achieve breakthroughs, then exploiting those breakthroughs with lightning speed. American military planners, including a respected officer named Leslie McNair, studied these campaigns intensely. They concluded that the United States needed specialized vehicles and units specifically designed to counter massed armored attacks. Traditional tanks were meant to support infantry and exploit breakthroughs. What was needed was something different, something faster, something that could race to threatened sectors and ambush enemy armor before it could achieve a breakthrough. This thinking led to the creation of the Tank Destroyer Force, an entirely new branch of the Army. The man chosen to develop the vehicles and tactics for this force was Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Davis Bruce, a brilliant planner from the War Department. Bruce had a clear vision of what he needed. He wanted a vehicle that was faster than a tank, with a powerful gun but less armor. Speed and hitting power would be the priorities. Protection would be sacrificed for mobility. Bruce explicitly objected to early designs because they were too heavy and too slow. When the Army tried to give him the M10 Wolverine tank destroyer, which was based on the Sherman tank chassis and weighed 30 tons, he pushed back hard. It wasn't fast enough. It couldn't maneuver the way he envisioned. When they later tried to give him the M36, which had an even bigger gun but was essentially just an M10 with more weight, he objected again for the same reasons. What Bruce wanted seemed almost impossible: a vehicle light enough to reach 50 miles per hour, armed with a gun powerful enough to destroy German tanks, yet cheap and simple enough to produce in large numbers. The early attempts were disasters. The M6, which was basically a 37mm anti-tank gun mounted on a truck, was utterly ineffective in North Africa. The M3, a half-track with a low-velocity 75mm gun, wasn't much better. Then, in late 1941 and early 1942, something remarkable happened. The design team at Buick Motor Division, part of General Motors, began working on a completely new approach. Led by automotive designer Harley Earl, they started from scratch rather than trying to adapt existing tank chassis. This was revolutionary. Previous tank destroyers had all been modifications of existing vehicles. Earl's team was designing a purpose-built machine. The result was designated the T-70. It weighed just 20 tons, half the weight of a Sherman tank. It used a torsion bar suspension system that provided a smooth, stable ride. Power came from a 9-cylinder radial aircraft engine, the same type used in Sherman tanks. But in the lighter Hellcat, it provided incredible performance. Most revolutionary of all was the Torque-Matic automatic transmission, an innovation that made the vehicle easier to drive and eliminated the need for complex manual shifting in combat situations. When testing began in 1943 at the General Motors Milford Proving Ground, the results stunned observers. The T-70 could reach 55 miles per hour on paved roads. It could climb steep obstacles. It could ford 6 feet of water. Its turret could traverse 360 degrees in just 24 seconds, far faster than German tanks. The gun could fire up to 20 rounds per minute in the hands of a well-trained crew. The first unit selected to test the new vehicle was the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion. These men had been training on the M3 gun motor carriage, a crude half-track with a 75mm gun mounted in the bed. The contrast couldn't have been more dramatic. The T-70 was fast, agile, and powerful. The unit's testing record was described as superlative. Their feedback helped refine the design, leading to improvements in the engine, transmission, and crew workspace. By March of 1944, the T-70 was officially standardized as a M18 gun motor carriage. The nickname Hellcat was already being used for promotional purposes. Production at the Buick factory was ramping up. Everything seemed perfect. The tank destroyer force finally had the vehicle Bruce had been demanding. But then something unexpected happened. Many of the generals who would actually have to use the Hellcat in combat didn't want it. The problem wasn't the Hellcat's speed or mechanical reliability. The problem was what had been sacrificed to achieve that speed. The M18's armor was shockingly thin. The lower hull was just 12.7 millimeters thick. That's half an inch. The hull floor was less than 5 millimeters, paper thin. The turret was slightly thicker at the front, but still only 25 millimeters. To put this in perspective, tests showed that 9 out of 30 standard .30 caliber armor-piercing bullets could penetrate the turret at 75 yards. The Hellcat had less armor than an M8 armored car. Making matters worse, the turret was open-topped, a feature shared by all American tank destroyers. The doctrine said this gave better visibility for ambush operations, which was true. But it also left the crew exposed to snipers, grenades, artillery fragments, and the brutal European winter weather. The air-cooled engine pulled cooling air through the crew compartment, essentially turning the fighting compartment into a giant refrigerator in cold weather. Crews complained bitterly about the freezing conditions. Then there was the gun. The 76mm M1 was the same weapon used on some variants of the Sherman tank. It was a good gun against medium German tanks like the Panzer IV. But by 1944, the Germans were fielding increasing numbers of Panther and Tiger tanks with thick, sloped armor. Ordnance tests in the United States claimed the 76 millimeter could penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor at 2,000 yards. These tests were deeply flawed. In reality, crews quickly learned that frontal shots at ranges beyond 300 yards had little effect on heavy German tanks. Meanwhile, the Panther's 75 millimeter gun and the Tiger's 88 millimeter gun could destroy a Hellcat at any range, from any angle. When Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commander of the 1st United States Army, was offered M18s for the Normandy invasion, he refused them. Bradley and his staff had serious concerns about the Hellcat's survivability and firepower. Of the 19 tank destroyer battalions allocated for the invasion of France, only 3 would be equipped with the Hellcat before landing. All 3 went to General George Patton's 3rd Army. The 603rd, 704th, and 705th Tank Destroyer Battalions came ashore in Normandy in late July 1944. The initial combat use of the M18 did little to quiet the skeptics. Due to the lack of major German armored counteroffensives immediately after D-Day, the Hellcats spent most of their time in convoy protection and infantry support roles. This wasn't what they'd been designed for. The thin armor that was supposed to enable hit-and-run tactics became a serious liability when the vehicles were used in static positions, supporting infantry. The open turret that was supposed to provide excellent visibility for ambush operations became a death trap when the Hellcats were exposed to artillery fire and infantry weapons. Crews complained about the lack of a coaxial machine gun for close-in defense. The single 50 caliber machine gun on the turret was inadequate. Many battalions removed the assistant driver position entirely, considering it redundant, or demanded that the vehicle be equipped with a bow machine gun. Crews were forced to use their main gun ammunition against infantry targets, depleting precious anti-tank rounds. The high explosive shells for the 76 millimeter gun were less effective than the 75 millimeter shells used by Sherman tanks, making infantry support missions even more problematic. It seemed like the skeptics had been right. The M18 was too lightly armored, undergunned, and poorly suited for the actual conditions of combat in Europe. Production plans were drastically cut. The original order for nearly 9,000 Hellcats was reduced to just over 2,500. The Army ground forces pushed for more M36 tank destroyers with 90 millimeter guns instead. The British and Soviets showed little interest in receiving Hellcats through Lend-Lease. The vehicle that Bruce had fought so hard to develop appeared to be a failure. But Hellcat crews were learning. They were adapting. They were developing new tactics that played to the vehicle's strengths rather than exposing its weaknesses. The speed that generals had worried was unnecessary, proved to be the key to survival. Hellcat crews learned to use their superior mobility to get into firing positions quickly, take their shots, and displace before the enemy could respond. The Germans called it shoot and scoot, and the Hellcat was the master of this tactic. The crews also learned the weak points of German armor. A well-placed shot between the mantlet and glacis plate of a Panther would cause the shell to ricochet down into the driving compartment, devastating the crew or crippling the tank. Side and rear shots were always preferable to frontal engagements. The Hellcat's fast turret traverse gave it a crucial advantage when maneuvering for flank shots. German tanks like the Panther and Tiger had relatively slow turret rotation. A Hellcat moving at high speed could get around to the side or rear faster than the German tank could traverse its turret to track the target. These tactics were put to the ultimate test in September of 1944 at Ericourt, the battle we heard about at the beginning, but Ericourt was just the opening act. The Hellcat's finest hour would come 3 months later in the frozen forests of Belgium during the Battle of the Bulge. In mid-December of 1944, Adolf Hitler launched a desperate gamble. He concentrated his remaining armored forces for a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, the same route the Germans had used to stunning effect in 1940. The goal was to split the Allied armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the west. The offensive achieved complete surprise. American forces were overrun. Units were surrounded. Panic threatened to spread through the Allied lines. One of the key objectives was the town of Bastogne, a crucial road junction in Belgium. If the Germans could capture Bastogne, they could control the entire road network in the region and continue their drive to Antwerp. The American command rushed the 101st Airborne Division to Bastogne, but paratroopers lacked heavy anti-tank weapons. They desperately needed armored support. This is where the M18 Hellcat's greatest attribute came into play: speed. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with M18s, was able to race to Bastogne at highway speeds, arriving just in time to reinforce the defenders. This was one of the few documented cases where the Hellcat's 55-mile-per-hour top speed was actually used operationally to get ahead of enemy forces. On December 19th and 20th, elements of the 10th Armored Division organized a defensive position at Noville, a small town north of Bastogne. With them were just 4 M18 Hellcats from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion. What followed was a master class in the proper use of tank destroyers. The German 2nd Panzer Division, desperately seeking to capture fuel dumps to continue their offensive, launched a major attack on Noville. The 4 Hellcats, working in coordination with paratroopers and other armored elements, turned the attack into a bloodbath. The M18s would engage from one position, destroying German tanks with well-aimed shots, then race to a new position before the enemy could bring effective fire to bear. The Germans were confused and disoriented by the Hellcats appearing, disappearing, and reappearing across the battlefield. The spoiling attack at Noville destroyed at least 30 German tanks and inflicted between 500 and 1,000 casualties on the attacking forces. Military historians have credited the M18 tank destroyers with 24 confirmed eliminations, including several Tiger tanks. The German attack stalled, leaving the Americans in control of the town. The Hellcats had bought crucial time for the defense of Bastogne to be organized. The battle wasn't over. On Christmas Day, the German 15th Panzer Division launched a major assault on positions held by the 101st Airborne Division around Bastogne. Once again, the M18s of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion were in the thick of the fighting. On that single day, the Hellcats were credited with destroying 27 German tanks. Only 6 M18s were lost. Throughout the entire siege of Bastogne, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion destroyed approximately 40 German tanks, while losing just 6 Hellcats. The battalion would later be awarded the Presidential Unit Citation for its role in the defense of Bastogne, one of the highest honors a unit can receive. The Battle of the Bulge transformed perceptions of the M18 Hellcat. The vehicle that many generals had been skeptical of had proven its worth in the most demanding combat conditions imaginable. The speed that seemed like an unnecessary luxury had proven to be a battle-winning capability. The light armor that seemed like a fatal flaw had been offset by superior tactics and crew skill. After the Bulge, the Army made a significant policy change. Many towed tank destroyer battalions, which had performed very poorly in the battle, were re-equipped with M18s. The towed 3-inch guns had proven nearly impossible to move quickly when positions were overrun, and many battalions suffered catastrophic losses. The self-propelled M18s, despite their thin armor, had proven far more survivable because of their ability to displace rapidly when threatened. By March of 1945, there were 540 M18 Hellcats in the European theater of operations, up from just 146 in June of 1944. Units that had been skeptical of the design were now requesting conversions to the Hellcat. Crews who had initially complained about the thin armor and open turret now praised the vehicle's speed, reliability, and ease of maintenance. One M18 commander reported that his vehicle operated under combat conditions averaging 80 to 100 miles per day during Third Army's drive from Saint-Lô to the German border near Strasbourg. In total, the vehicle was driven 1,870 miles. No repairs were necessary to either the vehicle or engine. Only minimal attention was paid to moving parts. He concluded that M18 engine performance was excellent under the most trying conditions and was highly thought of by all men in his outfit and others. The maintenance advantages of the Hellcat were significant. The drivetrain could be removed through a large access plate on the front hull by disconnecting it from the drive shaft and sliding the entire assembly out on extension rails. The engine could be partially removed through the rear access door for bottom maintenance without complete removal. These features meant that serious repairs that would take days on other vehicles could be accomplished in hours on the Hellcat, keeping more vehicles in the fight. But the most impressive statistic was still to come. By the end of World War II in Europe, M18 Hellcats had claimed 526 total eliminations, 498 in Europe, 17 in Italy, and 11 in the Pacific. The kills-to-losses ratio for Europe was 2.3 to 1. The overall kill-to-loss ratio was 2.4 to 1. This was higher than any other tank or tank destroyer fielded by United States forces in World War II. The vehicle that had been criticized as too lightly armored and undergunned had achieved the best combat record of any American armored fighting vehicle in the war. How did this happen? How did a vehicle with such apparent weaknesses achieve such remarkable success? The answer lies in a fundamental truth about armored warfare. In tank fighting, the first shot is usually the winning shot. The side that sees the enemy first, gets into position first, and fires first usually wins. The Hellcat's speed allowed it to get into advantageous positions before enemy tanks could react. Its fast turret traverse allowed it to engage targets quickly. Its excellent visibility from the open turret allowed crews to spot threats early. The thin armor, which seemed like such a weakness, actually made little practical difference in combat. Whether you had half an inch of armor or 3 inches of armor, a direct hit from a Panther or Tiger was going to end your day. The difference was that the Hellcat's speed and mobility meant it was much less likely to get hit in the first place. As one crew member put it, the best armor is not being where the enemy is shooting. The success of units like the 704th and 705th Tank Destroyer Battalions wasn't just about the vehicle. It was about crew training, tactical flexibility, and adaptability. American tank destroyer crews developed sophisticated techniques for engaging superior German armor. They learned to work closely with infantry and other armored units. They learned when to fight and when to displace. They learned to use terrain and concealment to maximum advantage. Distinguished units like the 603rd Tank Destroyer Battalion reported destroying upwards of 90 enemy armored fighting vehicles during the war in Europe. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, which fought at Aricourt, had a similar record. These weren't just numbers in a report. Each destroyed enemy tank meant dozens of American lives saved. Each successful ambush meant an enemy attack blunted or turned back. The Hellcat also saw service in other theaters, though in smaller numbers. In Italy, the 805th Tank Destroyer Battalion was the only unit fully equipped with M18s in that campaign. In the Pacific, 3 tank destroyer battalions deployed with Hellcats, including the 637th, which earned a Distinguished Unit Citation for its role in clearing fortified positions during the fierce fighting for Manila in early 1945. In the Pacific, as in Europe, the Hellcat was rarely used in the pure tank destroyer role it had been designed for. Japanese armor was far less formidable than German armor, and the M18 spent most of its time in infantry support and bunker-busting operations. The powerful 76mm gun which had struggled against Panther and Tiger armor, was more than adequate for destroying Japanese fortifications and the lighter Japanese tanks. One of the interesting aspects of the Hellcat service was that it remained largely unchanged throughout the war. Unlike the Sherman tank, which went through numerous modifications and variants, the M18 stayed essentially the same from standardization to the end of production. There were some improvements. Later models got a more powerful supercharged engine, producing 400 horsepower instead of 350. A muzzle brake was added to reduce dust blast. Winterization equipment was installed on later vehicles, but the basic design remained constant. The only significant variant produced in quantity was the M39 Armored Utility Vehicle. 640 early production M18s that had been returned to the factory for transmission modifications were converted to M39s by removing the turret and fitting seats for up to 8 men in the open fighting compartment. These were used as armored personnel carriers, prime movers for towed guns, and ammunition carriers. The M39 saw service in the final days of World War II in Europe and later in the Korean War. After World War II, many M18 Hellcats were exported to Allied nations. Yugoslavia received 260 and kept some in reserve until the early 1990s. The Republic of China received 214. Greece received 127. Iran, Venezuela, and the Philippines also operated M18s. Some of these vehicles saw combat in various conflicts decades after World War II ended, a testament to the basic soundness of the design. The story of the M18 Hellcat is a fascinating study in the difference between theoretical concerns and practical reality. On paper, the vehicle's weaknesses were glaring: thin armor, open turret, a gun that struggled against the heaviest German tanks. Many experienced officers looked at these specifications and concluded the Hellcat was poorly designed. Historian Stephen Zaloga, a respected authority on armored warfare, characterized the overall design as poorly balanced and stated that the Hellcat's combat record was attributable to the training and dedication of its crews, not to its design. But was the design really poorly balanced, or was it optimized for the actual conditions of combat rather than theoretical ideals? The M10 Wolverine, which had thicker armor and was considered more balanced, had a lower kill-to-loss ratio than the Hellcat. The M36 Jackson, with its powerful 90mm gun and heavier armor, also had a lower kill-to-loss ratio. The lightweight, supposedly under-armored and undergunned M18 outperformed them both. The lesson here is that in warfare, as in so many things, speed and agility can be more valuable than brute strength. The ability to be where you're needed, when you're needed, can outweigh raw firepower and protection. This is a lesson that would be relearned in later decades with vehicles like the Leopard 1 main battle tank, which prioritized mobility over armor in a way that would have been familiar to M18 crews. The human element cannot be overlooked. The Hellcat required skilled, well-trained crews to use effectively. It required commanders who understood how to employ the vehicle's strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. It required tactical flexibility and creativity. Units like the 704th and 705th Tank Destroyer Battalions didn't achieve their remarkable records by following doctrine rigidly. They achieved them by adapting, learning, and innovating in the crucible of combat. The contrast between initial skepticism and ultimate success is striking. General Omar Bradley refused M18s for his First Army before the Normandy invasion, yet after the Battle of the Bulge, the Army was converting towed battalions to M18s as fast as possible. The vehicle that wasn't wanted became the vehicle that was in demand. The design that was criticized became the design with the best combat record. This reversal of opinion didn't happen because the Hellcat changed. The vehicle that fought at Ericourt and Bastogne was essentially the same vehicle that Bradley had refused months earlier. What changed was understanding. What changed was appreciation for how the vehicle could be employed. What changed was recognition that the theoretical concerns that had dominated pre-combat evaluations didn't match the realities of actual fighting. The story of the M18 Hellcat is also a story about the nature of military innovation and institutional resistance to change. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Bruce had a vision of a fast, lightly armored tank destroyer years before the first Hellcat rolled off the production line. He fought against the institutional preference for heavier, more heavily armored vehicles. He objected to the M10 because it was too heavy and slow. He objected to the M36 for the same reasons. He kept pushing for the vehicle he believed was necessary, even when conventional wisdom argued against him. Bruce was eventually proven right, but it took combat experience to demonstrate the validity of his vision. The tank destroyer force as a whole faced skepticism from the start. Many officers questioned whether specialized anti-tank units were necessary. The doctrine of holding tank destroyer battalions in reserve to counter enemy armored breakthroughs was criticized as too defensive-minded for an army on the offensive. There were arguments that regular tanks could handle anti-tank duties just fine. Yet the combat record speaks for itself. 526 confirmed eliminations, the highest kill-to-loss ratio of any American armored fighting vehicle in the war. Presidential unit citations for outstanding performance. Tank destroyer battalions played crucial roles in major battles, from Normandy to the Rhine. The specialists had proven their worth. It's worth noting that the M18 wasn't perfect. The complaints about inadequate firepower against heavy German tanks were legitimate. The introduction of high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition in fall of 1944 helped, but this special ammunition was never available in sufficient quantities. Crews would have loved a more powerful main gun. The desire for an armored roof over the turret was universal. The lack of a coaxial machine gun for close defense was a genuine problem. The thin armor, while less important than critics thought, still meant the vehicle couldn't stand up to direct hits. But in war, there are no perfect weapons. There are only trade-offs. The M18's designers chose to prioritize speed and mobility over armor and gun size. That choice created weaknesses, but it also created the strengths that made the vehicle so effective. A heavier, more heavily armored Hellcat with a 90mm gun would have been more powerful in direct engagements, but it wouldn't have been as fast or as mobile. It wouldn't have been able to get into position as quickly. It might have had a lower kill-to-loss ratio, not a higher one. The Hellcat's career was relatively brief. Production ended in October of 1944 after just 2,507 vehicles had been built, far short of the original plans for nearly 9,000. The vehicle was retired from United States service immediately after the end of World War II. The Army had no use for lightly armored tank destroyers in the early Cold War era. The M36 with its 90mm gun was preferred for units that remained equipped with tank destroyers, and even that role was gradually absorbed by main battle tanks in the following decades. But for a brief, intense period from the summer of 1944 to the spring of 1945, the M18 Hellcat was the deadliest American armored fighting vehicle on the battlefield. In the frozen forests around Bastogne, in the rolling fields near Haricourt, in countless smaller engagements across France, Belgium, and Germany, Hellcat crews proved that speed, skill, and tactical flexibility could overcome apparent disadvantages in armor and armament. The legacy of the M18 extends beyond its impressive statistics. It demonstrated that unconventional designs could succeed if employed properly. It showed that institutional skepticism could be overcome by combat results. It proved that crew training and tactical doctrine were at least as important as raw specifications, and it provided a case study in the eternal military trade-off between protection, firepower, and mobility. Today, surviving M18 Hellcats can be found in museums around the world, preserved as reminders of a different era of warfare. The vehicle with the distinctive sloped hull and open turret looks small and vulnerable compared to modern main battle tanks. But those thin armor plates and that open fighting compartment housed some of the most effective tank killers of World War II. When you look at an M18 Hellcat in a museum, you're looking at a vehicle that was criticized by generals, doubted by many officers, and considered poorly designed by some historians. You're also looking at the American armored fighting vehicle with the highest kill-to-loss ratio in World War II. You're looking at the vehicle that helped turn back the last great German offensive in the West. You're looking at a machine that, despite all its apparent flaws, did its job better than any alternative. The men who crewed these vehicles didn't have the luxury of hindsight or the comfort of theoretical debates. They had a mission: stop German armor. They had a tool, the M18 Hellcat, and they made it work. Sergeant Henry Hartmann, destroying 6 German tanks in a single battle near Ericourt. The crews of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion racing to Bastogne and turning back German panzers on Christmas Day. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper, emerging from the fog to destroy German tanks at point-blank range. These men, and thousands like them, took a vehicle that many didn't want and turned it into a war-winning weapon. In the end, the story of the M18 Hellcat isn't really about specifications or design philosophy. It's about the men who fought in them. It's about tactical innovation and adaptability. It's about proving the skeptics wrong through actions rather than words. It's about the complex relationship between weapon design, doctrine, and combat reality. The Hellcat was fast. It was agile. It was deadly. It had the highest kill count of any American armored fighting vehicle in World War II. And it almost didn't make it to the battlefield because some generals thought it was too light, too fast, too different from what they expected a tank destroyer to be. The vehicle that one general dismissed would go on to achieve the combat record that every other American armored vehicle would be measured against. That's the remarkable true story of how one general's doubts were overcome by the dedication and skill of the crews who proved that sometimes the unorthodox answer is the right answer. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into one of World War II's most fascinating armored vehicles, please consider subscribing to our channel and turning on notifications so you never miss our videos. We have many more stories like this one, exploring the lesser-known aspects of military history. Leave a comment below and let us know what vehicle or battle you'd like us to cover next. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.